Okay, so here we are. It's Saturday, April 11th, 2026, and for 43 long days, pretty much the entire world has been holding its breath. Right now, there's this fragile 2-week ceasefire, and honestly, it's the only thing standing between a truly devastating regional war and maybe, just maybe, a path to peace. All eyes are on Islamabad, where negotiators are gathering, and literally everything is hanging in the balance. And look, the stakes here, they just couldn't be higher. We're not just talking about some regional spat. This quote, it really gets to the heart of it. The ripple effects, especially when it comes to food supplies getting disrupted, we're talking about a potential humanitarian catastrophe, not just in the Middle East, but on a truly global scale. And then there's the pain you're probably already feeling, the immediate economic hit. Oil, it's hovering right around $150 a barrel. And, that's not just some number you see on the news. No, that's crippling inflation. That's the very real threat of a global recession that hits every single one of us right in the wallet. So, to really get a handle on what's going on, we're going to break this down into 5 key parts. First, we'll look at the world crisis as a whole. Then the peace talks, the big gamble in Islamabad. After that, we have to talk about the Strait of Hormuz. We'll also cover the major sticking points that could blow this whole thing up. And finally, we'll look at the big picture, the new economic order this could be creating. Right, so first up, the crisis itself. And the number one thing to get here is that this isn't just about oil. That's a huge misunderstanding. This conflict, it's also completely shut down natural gas exports from Qatar. And it's crippled the supply of urea, which, is a critical ingredient for fertilizer. So what you end up with is this incredibly dangerous situation, an energy crisis and a food crisis, both hitting the entire world at the exact same time. And that brings us to Islamabad. This is a huge deal. Pakistan, with some serious backing from China, has actually managed to get the US and Iran to sit down at the same table. Now, you have to understand, this isn't just another diplomatic meeting. No, everyone is framing this as the last best chance to pull back from the brink before this thing explodes into a much, much wider war. But this leads to the big question, right? The one everyone is asking. We keep hearing this word ceasefire, but what does that really mean right now? In this situation, has the fighting actually stopped for good, or are we looking at something else entirely? And well, here's the thing. The consensus among analysts is pretty clear. A lot of them are calling it a make-believe ceasefire. Think of it more like an operational pause. A strategic timeout that lets both sides catch their breath, redeploy their forces, resupply. It is not a real commitment to peace. Not yet, anyway. Whether it turns into one, well, that's what's going to be decided in the next few days. Okay, so this brings us to Iran's ace in the hole, their single most powerful piece of leverage, control over the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, think about it. This used to be a global energy superhighway. Now, it's basically become a toll booth, and you better believe Iran is the one sitting in the booth collecting the fees. And this chart really shows you why that control is such a big deal. We're talking about 1/5 of the entire world's oil and 1/5 of its liquefied natural gas, all having to squeeze through this one narrow waterway. So, yeah, when Iran decides to flex its muscles here, the entire global economy feels the shockwaves. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of how this new toll booth works. It's not simple. First, there's a flat fee, something like $2 million per tanker. Then, on top of that, there's a per-barrel tax. But here's the kicker, the real game changer, the payment method. Iran is demanding payment only in Chinese yuan or cryptocurrency. This is a direct shot, a massive challenge to the US dollar's 50-year reign over the energy trade. So, the stakes are sky high. The talks are on. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, a lot. There are some huge sticking points, these core issues where it looks like neither side is willing to budge an inch. And honestly, any one of them could make these talks collapse before they even really get started. And, just a few days ago, there was this huge wave of relief. This message came out from the Pakistani mediators, and it was reportedly approved by the US, announcing an immediate ceasefire everywhere, including Lebanon. It seemed so clear, so comprehensive. It felt like a real breakthrough. But then, the rug got pulled out. All of a sudden, the US and Israel are saying that the part about Lebanon, the place where attacks have actually continued and even gotten worse, was all a misunderstanding.
Now, for Iran, this is not some minor detail you can just brush aside. No way. This is a potential deal breaker. In their eyes, all these fronts are connected.
And this gets to Iran's core position. They've basically laid out 4 demands that they see as completely non-negotiable. 1, an immediate and total lifting of all sanctions. 2, the full release of all their frozen assets. 3, that ceasefire has to apply to all fronts, especially Lebanon, no exceptions. And 4, their own 10-point plan has to be the starting point for the talks. For Tehran, these aren't just things they want. This is the price of admission to even sit at the table.
Okay, let's zoom out for a second here, because beyond all the military moves and the diplomatic back and forth, something much bigger is happening. This whole conflict is acting like a giant accelerator pedal for huge changes in the global economic system. The world's financial map, it's literally being redrawn in real time as we speak. And right at the heart of this massive shift is the petrodollar system. You know, that 50-year-old deal that is basically guaranteed global demand for the US dollar because all the oil is priced in it. Well, what's happening right now is arguably the most serious challenge that system has ever faced. Iran's toll booth at the Strait of Hormuz, that's a direct assault on this huge pillar of American economic power. And all this has led to a really provocative theory that's starting to gain a lot of traction, especially when you see how this conflict conveniently sidelines huge energy players like Iran and Qatar. It's this idea of the petrogas dollar. The theory goes something like this. The U.S. strategy isn't just about this one conflict. It's about systematically taking out global energy competitors, one by one, to force the world to become dependent on American liquefied natural gas, which would, of course, be priced exclusively in U.S. dollars. So that leaves us with one final, huge question. The people in that room in Islamabad, they think they're there to negotiate an end to a 43-day war. But what if they're actually deciding something much, much bigger? What if they're deciding the future of the entire global economic order? The fate of millions of people and the dominance of the US dollar? All of it could be decided in the next 2 weeks. The whole world is watching.
The bombs still dropping in Beirut, despite trust being at absolute zero between all these parties, the diplomatic machinery hasn't actually collapsed.
Yeah, in fact, it's accelerating.
Yeah. If we look at the footage from this morning, delegations are literally arriving at a heavily fortified hotel in South Asia. If the ceasefire is already fracturing, how did both sides agree to sit down in the capital of Pakistan? Like, what was the leverage that actually got them into the room?
Well, the leverage was a massive quiet financial concession.
Well, the frozen funds?
Exactly. So the negotiations are being held at the Serena Hotel in Islamabad. And currently, the Pakistani military has locked down the entire perimeter. I mean, it is a fortress.
Right.
But getting the Iranian delegation to show up was not guaranteed at all. Up until the last 24 hours, Iran flatly refused to send its top-tier officials. They laid out very strict preconditions. Israel must implement a temporary halt on Lebanese strikes, and the U.S. must release frozen Iranian assets.
And the U.S. actually caved on that. We have an administration that has spent 43 days projecting overwhelming military force, and they are the ones unfreezing billions just to get their adversaries to sit in a hotel.
Yes. The reports confirm that the U.S. quietly authorized the unfreezing of $6 billion of Iranian funds held in Qatar.
$6 billion? That's wow.
And furthermore, they heavily pressured Israel into a temporary operational pause in Lebanon, literally just long enough to get the Iranians on planes to Islamabad.
So let's unpack the mechanics of that $6 billion, because unfreezing funds is a term thrown around on the news constantly, but the actual process is incredibly complex.
It really is. It's not just handing over a briefcase of cash.
Right. So where did this money even come from, and how does Qatar fit into this whole thing?
Okay, so it requires understanding the architecture of global sanctions. This specific $6 billion originally came from South Korea.
That's Korea.
Yeah. For years, South Korea bought Iranian oil. But because of U.S. banking sanctions, they couldn't actually pay Iran directly. The money just sat in restricted South Korean bank accounts.
Okay.
Then, under a previous diplomatic arrangement, the U.S. allowed those funds to be transferred to the central bank in Qatar. But it was under the strict condition that Iran could only draw down on that money for heavily monitored humanitarian goods, food and medicine.
Right, but the U.S. essentially holds a veto over that Qatari account.
Exactly. The U.S. Treasury Department can threaten secondary sanctions on Qatari banks if they allow the money to move without U.S. blessing.
Which would cripple Qatar's financial sector.
Precisely. So by lifting that hold now, the U.S. is giving Iran immediate access to immense capital. It is a massive carrot.
And look at who is showing up to claim that carrot. I mean, the U.S. side is a heavyweight political and military roster. You have Vice President J.D. Vance, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and General Brad Cooper, the commander of CNTCOM.
Yeah, that's top-tier representation.
And Iran sent Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, and their top national security officials. But my question is, why Islamabad? Pakistan seems like an incredibly specific and delicate choice for a venue.
The choice of Pakistan is a masterclass in modern geopolitical signaling.
Really? How so?
Well, Pakistan is a historical ally of both the United States and Saudi Arabia. They share intelligence, they buy U.S. weapons. However, over the last decade, Pakistan's infrastructure and economy have become deeply, deeply integrated with China.
Through the Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly. So, by agreeing to meet in Islamabad, neither side is entirely on hostile territory. But the shadow of Beijing is looming over the entire table.
So, the U.S. is negotiating in a city where Chinese economic influence is arguably stronger than American diplomatic influence.
Precisely. It reflects the shifting global power structure.
And the framework they're negotiating over isn't even a U.S. document. They are using Iran's 10-point plan. And the sources detail what's in this plan, and if you are looking at it from a traditional Western perspective, the demands are staggering.
They are very aggressive.
I mean, we're talking about U.S. acceptance of civilian uranium enrichment, the total immediate removal of all economic sanctions, the complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from the Persian Gulf, and perhaps most surprisingly, war reparations paid to Iran.
Yeah, those points are critical to analyze, not just for what they ask, but for what they represent about Iran's psychological posture right now.
So let me play devil's advocate here for a second. War reparations. Asking the United States to pay war reparations after a 43-day conflict, is that a serious demand, or is this just classic negotiation anchoring?
You mean like the door-in-the-face technique?
Exactly. The door-in-the-face technique where you ask for something absurd so that when you concede it, keeping your uranium enrichment suddenly looks like a very reasonable compromise.
It is absolutely an anchoring tactic. But it also serves a domestic purpose for the Iranian leadership.
How so?
By demanding reparations, they signal to their own population that they are the aggrieved party who successfully defended their sovereignty.
Right. It projects strength at home.
Exactly. But you are completely right to focus on the anchoring. They know the U.S. will never pay reparations. They know the U.S. is highly unlikely to completely withdraw from the Gulf.
Yeah, that's a non-starter.
Right. But if they concede those points, they might secure the two things they actually care about: the formal recognition of their nuclear program and the lifting of sanctions.
But there is one point on that list that isn't just a negotiation tactic. It's a physical reality right now. Iran is demanding official recognition of their control over the Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, this is the big one.
And if we pivot from the diplomatic rooms in Pakistan to the waters of the Persian Gulf, this is where the geopolitical chess game slams directly into the listener's wallet.
Absolutely, the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, it operates as the toll booth at the end of the world.
Now, the U.S. administration has repeatedly claimed in the last week that the strait is open and that international traffic is flowing.
But the maritime tracking data from our sources tells a completely different story.
Right. It remains firmly under Iranian naval control. I mean, on a recent tracking day, only 4 commercial ships passed through. That is the lowest volume recorded this entire month. And the kicker, all 4 ships were carrying Iranian oil.
Yeah, Iran hasn't just blockaded the strait. They have effectively privatized it.
Privatized it. Wow.
They have taken one of the most vital international waterways on the planet and subjected it to their own sovereign tax regime.
We need to explain how they actually do that. Because, you don't just put a boom barrier across 21 miles of ocean.
No, you definitely don't.
So how does a sanctioned country physically enforce a toll booth on the busiest maritime highway interchange in the world, especially with the U.S. Navy sitting right there?
It comes down to asymmetric naval warfare. Iran doesn't use massive destroyers to block the strait. They use hundreds of highly maneuverable fast attack craft armed with anti-ship missiles.
Like speedboats with rockets on them?
Essentially, yes, but highly advanced ones. And they have shore-based, mobile anti-ship ballistic missile batteries hidden in the mountainous coastline. Plus, they use extensive drone surveillance.
Okay, so if a ship approaches, what happens?
If a commercial container ship approaches, Iran intercepts it via radio and demands payment. If the ship refuses, they swarm it. They might board it via helicopter, or they simply threaten to target it from the shore.
And obviously, the shipping companies aren't going to risk their crew in a multi-million-dollar vessel.
Right. The shipping insurance companies look at that risk, and they refuse to insure the vessels unless the operators comply with Iran's demands.
And those demands are exorbitant. The reports indicate they are charging $2 million per container ship just for safe passage.
Just to pass through.
And for oil tankers, it's a $1 tax per barrel of oil. But here is the detail that absolutely shatters the current global financial order. They aren't asking for US dollars.
This is the crux of the geopolitical shift. Payment is being actively demanded in cryptocurrency or Chinese yuan.
Let's break down the mechanics of that, because that is fascinating. Why cryptocurrency?
Because the entire U.S. sanctions regime relies on the SWIFT banking system.
Right.
When you wire money internationally in dollars, it clears through Western financial institutions, which means the U.S. Treasury can track it, freeze it, or block it.
So if you use dollars, the U.S. has a say.
Exactly. But cryptocurrencies, specifically decentralized stablecoins or state-backed digital currencies, bypasses that ledger entirely. A shipping company in Asia can transfer $2 million in crypto directly to an Iranian wallet in seconds, completely invisibly to the U.S. banking system.
And nations are complying. I mean, South Korea, a major treaty-bound U.S. ally, has sent a special emissary to Tehran specifically to negotiate safe passage for their vessels.
Yeah.
And by doing so, they are effectively legitimizing Iran's authority over the strait, validating their tax regime, and completely ignoring Washington's sanctions.
When survival's on the line, economic pragmatism overrides geopolitical alliances every single time. Let's look at the sheer mathematics of why South Korea has no choice here. 20% of the world's natural gas and a massive percentage of the daily global oil supply pass through that narrow 21-mile stretch of water. It is literally the jugular vein of industrial civilization.
Which brings up a question I think a lot of people listening are asking right now.
Okay, what's that?
If the most important oil choke point in the world has been heavily restricted or effectively closed for 43 days, why hasn't the price of gas quadrupled in my hometown? Why aren't we seeing absolute panic at the pumps today?
It's a great question. And the answer is all about the physics of maritime logistics. It's called transit delay.
Transit delay.
Right. When a supertanker loads up with crude oil in the Persian Gulf, it doesn't magically appear in a refinery in Europe or North America the next day. It takes roughly 4 to 6 weeks for that ship to navigate the oceans, offload its cargo, have that crude refined into gasoline or diesel, and then be distributed to local gas stations.
So the fuel we are putting in our cars today is essentially a ghost. It's the oil that was shipped a month and a half ago, right before this war escalated.
That's right. The true economic shock, the massive unfillable void in global supply created over the last 43 days, hasn't made landfall yet.
Oh, man.
The data strongly forecasts that the real pain, the massive spikes in energy costs and subsequent skyrocketing inflation, is going to hit Western consumers squarely in late April and early May.
But it's not just about fuel for transportation or heating homes. The sources point to a terrifying humanitarian crisis brewing just beneath the surface of the energy markets.
Yes, specifically regarding a compound called urea.
Walk us through this. Why would a disruption in the Strait of Hormuz lead to a global food crisis or starvation?
Okay, so it requires understanding the Haber-Bosch process.
The Haber-Bosch process.
Right, which is the foundation of modern agriculture. To grow food at the scale required to feed 8 billion people, you need artificial fertilizer.
Okay.
And to make artificial fertilizer, you need nitrogen. The way we get nitrogen into the soil is through urea. But to manufacture urea, you need massive, continuous amounts of natural gas.
And 20% of the world's natural gas comes through Hormuz.
Exactly. So when that natural gas supply is choked off, the chemical plants in Europe and Asia that produce urea have to shut down or reduce their output drastically.
Because they literally don't have the raw ingredients.
Right. And then the price of fertilizer skyrockets. Farmers in the global south and places across Africa and Southeast Asia, they operate on razor-thin margins. If they cannot afford fertilizer, they simply don't plant as much. Or their crop yields plummet by 40 to 50%.
Which means less food overall.
Drastically less. Analysts are projecting that this 43-day disruption could trigger widespread famine later this year, potentially costing millions of lives.
It perfectly illustrates how hyper-connected the system is. I mean, a political decision to launch a missile strike in the Middle East mathematically translates to empty plates and starvation on entirely different continents months later.
It really does. And if we look even deeper at the financial mechanics of this toll booth, the insistence on payment in Chinese yuan or crypto is a direct, calculated attack on the petrodollar system.
I really want to spend some time on this because petrodollar is a term that gets thrown around in economic forums all the time, but its actual function is rarely explained.
Yeah, it's often misunderstood.
So how does pricing oil in dollars actually benefit the United States?
We have to go back to 1974. The U.S. had just come off the gold standard, inflation was rampant, and they needed a way to stabilize the value of the U.S. dollar.
Okay, setting the scene.
So the Nixon administration, spearheaded by Henry Kissinger, struck a profound deal with Saudi Arabia and the OPEC nations. The deal was simple. The U.S. would provide absolute military protection and weapons to the Saudi royal family. In exchange, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all of its oil sales exclusively in U.S. dollars.
Exclusively in dollars.
Right, and to invest its surplus oil profits into U.S. Treasury bonds.
So, if Japan or France wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, they couldn't use yen or francs. They had to acquire U.S. dollars first.
Exactly. And because every nation on Earth needs oil to survive, every central bank on Earth was suddenly forced to hold massive reserves of U.S. dollars.
Which creates an artificial, permanent, global demand for the U.S. currency.
Precisely. Which means the United States can print almost unlimited amounts of money and run massive national deficits without suffering hyperinflation. Because the rest of the world is constantly absorbing those dollars to buy energy.
It is the structural foundation of America's economic superpower status.
Yes, it allows the U.S. to fund its military hegemony. But right now, in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is proving that energy can be traded outside of that system.
Because they're taking yuan and crypto?
Exactly. If Iran successfully forces the globe to trade energy in yuan or crypto, the artificial demand for the dollar drops. If the demand for the dollar drops, the U.S. can no longer finance its debt as easily.
Right. Interest rates soar, inflation spikes domestically.
And the foundation of U.S. economic dominance fractures.
So this brings up the most glaring question of this entire deep dive.
Let's hear it.
If this toll booth is threatening global famine, if it's dismantling the petrodollar, if it's holding the global economy hostage, why doesn't the U.S. military just forcefully reopen the strait?
Right.
Like, why not just sail a carrier strike group in there, clear the skies, destroy the anti-ship batteries, and open the trade routes?
Well, that leads us to the most shocking revelation found in these military forecasts.
Which is?
We are witnessing the definitive end of unquestioned U.S. air supremacy.
Yeah, the numbers in these reports are just staggering. The U.S. military has suffered devastating losses over the last 43 days, revealing a critical depletion of advanced resources.
It's unlike anything we've seen in modern warfare.
Let's look at one specific incident detailed in the dispatches. Sources report the U.S. lost nearly $500 million, $480 million precisely in aircraft, in a single two-day rescue operation just to retrieve a downed pilot.
That marks the highest single-day loss of aircraft for the United States since the Vietnam War.
Wow. Since Vietnam.
We are talking about an operational failure of a magnitude not seen in over 50 years.
I mean, we're talking about F-18 fighter jets, C-130 transport planes, Black Hawk helicopters, heavily armored A-10 Warhogs, and billion-dollar airborne radar systems, all lost in a 48-hour window.
Yes.
And it's not just the older legacy aircraft that are vulnerable. Even the state-of-the-art F-35 stealth fighters sitting at Israel's Nevatim Air Base were struck and damaged by Iranian cluster warheads.
Yeah, let's break down the mechanics of that strike because it's important. Nevatim is one of the most heavily defended air bases on the planet. But Iran didn't use a single massive explosive.
They used cluster munitions.
Right. They used ballistic missiles equipped with cluster munitions. So as the missile approaches the base, it breaks apart high in the atmosphere, releasing hundreds of smaller bomblets that scatter over a massive area.
Okay, so it covers a huge radius.
Exactly. Even if the Patriot missile batteries intercept the main body of the missile, the bomblets still rain down. And they shred the delicate stealth coating and electronics of the F-35s sitting on the tarmac.
The sheer volume and precision of these strikes have just completely overwhelmed the U.S. defense systems. And the reports emphasize that the U.S. is now critically low on the very munitions needed to fight this specific kind of high-intensity war.
They are running out of Tomahawk cruise missiles, PASI-3 interceptors, and JASM missiles.
Explain to us what these weapons actually do and why they are so hard to replace. Let's start with the PASI-3.
Okay, so PASI-3 stands for Patriot Advanced Capability 3. Older missile defense systems worked by flying close to an incoming missile and exploding, basically hoping the shrapnel would destroy it.
Right.
But the PASI-3 is different. It's a hit-to-kill interceptor. It relies on incredibly precise radar and onboard guidance to physically collide with the incoming ballistic missile at thousands of miles per hour.
Like hitting a bullet with a bullet.
Exactly like that. The engineering required for that level of precision is immense.
And the JASSM.
The Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile. It's a stealthy cruise missile dropped from bombers. It allows a plane to stay hundreds of miles away from enemy air defenses, drop the missile, and let the missile navigate itself to the target.
But you can't just ramp up production and print more of these overnight. Why is the supply chain so constrained?
Because of geopolitics and metallurgy.
Metallurgy.
Yeah. To build the guidance systems, the radar seekers, and the incredibly precise actuators that steer the fins of a PEG-3 or JASSM, you need rare earth elements. Specifically metals like neodymium and samarium, which are used to create hyper-powerful, lightweight magnets.
Okay, and who controls the global processing of rare earth elements?
China. Upwards of 80 to 90% of global processing capacity is in China.
Yeah.
And according to recent reports, China has placed strict export restrictions on these specific minerals.
Wow.
So the U.S. defense industrial base is finding itself entirely reliant on its primary geopolitical rival for the raw materials needed to restock its rapidly depleting arsenal.
I think we really need to internalize what this means. I mean, if you grew up watching the news from the 1990s onward, from the Gulf War to the invasion of Iraq, we have all been conditioned by this visual of U.S. air superiority as an invincible, omnipresent force.
The doctrine of shock and awe.
Exactly. Shock and awe. If the U.S. military is suddenly being described by analysts as a paper tiger in this specific theater, how did this happen? Did U.S. technology regress?
No, the technology didn't regress. The paradigm of warfare shifted.
How so?
To understand how Iran achieved this, we have to look at their 20-year strategy. Iran knew they could never match the United States plane for plane or ship for ship. A symmetrical war was a guaranteed loss.
Right.
So they changed the geography of the battlefield. Over 2 decades, they moved their critical military infrastructure, their missile factories, and their launch silos deep underground, literally burrowing into the Zagros Mountains.
Which renders the traditional U.S. strategy of dropping massive bunker-busting bombs from the air far less effective. Because you can't bomb a factory if it's under hundreds of feet of solid granite.
Exactly. And tactically, they changed the very physics of how they target our planes.
What do you mean by the physics?
Well, traditionally, air defense relies on active emitting radar. A radar dish on the ground sends out a radio wave. It bounces off a U.S. fighter jet. The dish receives the bounce back, calculates the distance, and fires a missile.
But the U.S. figured out how to counter that decades ago.
Right. The U.S. developed anti-radiation missiles. If an enemy radar dish turns on, the U.S. plane detects the signal, fires a missile that simply rides that invisible radio beam all the way back to the source, and destroys the dish.
It's the classic analogy. It's like a guy standing in a pitch-black room, turning on a flashlight to find you.
Right.
The second he turns on the flashlight, you know exactly where he is, and you shoot at the flashlight.
That is the perfect way to visualize it.
Yeah.
So what did Iran do? They turned off the flashlights.
Wow.
They stopped relying on active emitting radar that gives away their position. Instead, they transitioned to passive, optical, and infrared seeking systems.
How does that work?
A passive infrared sensor doesn't emit any signal. It just sits there, silently looking for the heat signature of a jet engine against the cold sky. Or it uses high-resolution optical cameras to visually identify the profile of the aircraft.
So it's basically just watching.
Exactly. And because it isn't broadcasting a signal, the U.S. plane's warning systems often don't even know they're being tracked until the missile is already off the rail. This technological pivot caught the U.S. and Israeli air forces completely off guard.
And it's not just the Air Force taking a hit. The Navy is sitting out in the surrounding oceans, essentially paralyzed.
Yeah, the vulnerability of the U.S. Navy is a massive theme in these military assessments. Historically, the cornerstone of American power projection is the carrier strike group. You park an aircraft carrier off the coast of a country, and you dominate the airspace.
Right.
But today, these multi-billion-dollar carriers cannot get close to the Iranian shore.
Because of the anti-ship missiles?
Specifically, hypersonic anti-ship missiles and autonomous drone swarms. If a carrier comes within striking distance, it risks being overwhelmed by dozens of missiles flying at Mach 5 or faster, weaving unpredictably.
We even saw reports in the last month of U.S. amphibious assault ships, the massive vessels designed to deploy Marines directly onto hostile beaches, having to rapidly retreat.
Yeah. The legacy strategy of projecting massive power from the sea is being neutralized by incredibly cheap asymmetric technology.
But despite these staggering losses, the U.S. isn't just packing up. I mean, the sources detail a massive active troop movement occurring right now.
Yes, and this is the detail that makes the current ceasefire so incredibly tense. Analysts report that the U.S. is surging upwards of 50,000 troops to the region. They are moving them into heavily fortified bases across allied Gulf nations.
Which forces us to ask a very dark question about this diplomatic push in Pakistan. Is this two-week ceasefire actually a genuine pursuit of peace? Or is it what military strategists call an operational pause?
An operational pause is when an army temporarily halts combat, not to end the war, but to rebuild logistics, restock munitions, and maneuver forces for a massive offensive.
Oh, wow.
Given the depletion of air assets, the U.S. might be using these 14 days to reposition those 50,000 troops for a ground invasion.
A ground war in Iran. I mean, that would make the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan look like a training exercise.
Yeah.
The geography alone, the Zagros Mountains, is a natural fortress. You can't just roll tanks through those passes easily.
It would be a catastrophic logistical undertaking. And the sheer potential for that escalation is exactly why this military stalemate has triggered massive geopolitical earthquakes far beyond the borders of the Middle East.
Which brings us to the broader geopolitical tectonic shifts. We are watching the birth of a multipolar reality happen in real time.
We really are.
Let's look at the initial stated goal of this conflict. Many hardliners in the U.S. and Israel openly pushed for regime change in Iran. The theory was that a massive bombing campaign would shatter the Iranian economy, cause the population to rise up, and overthrow the government.
But the data shows that theory failed entirely. It's a classic sociological phenomenon known as the rally around the flag effect.
Right.
When a nation is subjected to intense external bombardment, internal political divisions often evaporate. The population unified behind the state machinery for survival.
But the psychological shifts outside of Iran are even more profound. Look at the Gulf states nations like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The analysts say they are terrified right now.
Absolutely terrified.
Why? I mean, they aren't the ones being bombed.
Because the illusion of their security has been shattered. For decades, the Gulf monarchies relied on an implicit contract: provide the West with oil, and the U.S. military will serve as your invincible bodyguard.
But over the last 43 days...
They have watched U.S. military bases in their own region get hit by Iranian missiles with near impunity.
And unlike Iran, which spent 20 years burying its infrastructure underground, the Gulf state's entire economic lifeline is completely exposed.
Exactly. The Saudi oil refineries, the desalination plants that provide their drinking water, it is all sitting entirely above ground. They realize that if a full regional war breaks out, their entire economy could be wiped off the map in a matter of hours by a drone swarm.
So they are looking at the limitations of U.S. air defense.
And they're being forced to reconsider their absolute, unquestioning reliance on Western alliances.
And it's not just a military vulnerability. There's a massive financial hostage situation unfolding too.
The sovereign wealth vulnerability. Saudi Arabia is reportedly sitting on over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds and Western assets.
$1 trillion.
Yes, and they watched very closely 2 years ago when the West weaponized the SWIFT banking system and froze hundreds of billions of dollars of Russia's sovereign assets over the war in Ukraine.
So the Saudis are looking at their own balance sheet, looking at Washington, and realizing that if they step out of line, or if the global financial system fractures further, their $1 trillion could be frozen with a single keystroke.
Exactly. That fear is accelerating their desire to diversify. They are actively looking for ways to store wealth that the U.S. Treasury cannot control.
And we have to look at the rest of the global map because the U.S. military, despite its size, does not have infinite resources.
No, it doesn't. This conflict has acted as a massive strategic vacuum.
A vacuum.
The U.S. has been forced to divert vital weapons shipments, intelligence-gathering assets, and top-level political attention away from the conflict in Ukraine and away from containing China in the South China Sea.
Which is an absolute windfall for Moscow and Beijing.
It is the optimal scenario for them. They get to watch their primary geopolitical rival exhaust its specialized military stockpiles and burn massive amounts of diplomatic capital in a grinding Middle Eastern conflict. without having to fire a single shot themselves.
It really forces you to examine the grand strategy of the current administration.
It does.
I mean, we heard the Trump administration come into power running on a platform of focusing inward. The rhetoric was all about the American system rebuilding domestic manufacturing, enacting protective tariffs, ending the so-called forever wars, and avoiding foreign entanglements.
Right.
Yet here we are, 43 days into an incredibly costly, resource-draining conflict on the other side of the planet.
You are watching a real-time, high-stakes clash of ideologies within the U.S. power structure.
Explain that.
On one side, you have the deeply entrenched neoconservative element that still fundamentally believes in global military hegemony and views Iran as an existential threat that must be crushed by force.
Okay.
On the other side, you have the economic nationalist element that desires to withdraw from global policing, reindustrialize the American homeland, and avoid these exact types of quagmires.
And right now, judging by the deployment of 50,000 troops, the neoconservative instinct seems to have completely hijacked the nationalist agenda.
And the tragic irony of that hijacking is that by trying to assert control, they have drastically accelerated the transition to a multipolar world.
Yeah, the U.S. and Israel are finding themselves increasingly isolated diplomatically. Meanwhile, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their newly added members are aggressively pushing forward with de-dollarization.
They are using this specific crisis, this demonstration of U.S. vulnerability, as the catalyst to build alternative financial structures. We are seeing the testing of systems like Enbridge, designed to settle international trade in local currencies, completely bypassing the U.S. banking system.
It is a strategic backfire of historic proportions. The stated goal of the initial strikes was to forcibly keep Iran in check, to weaken their military capabilities, and to maintain Western dominance in the region.
But the actual result?
What's the actual result?
By launching this attack, the U.S. and Israel inadvertently stress-tested Iran's military and proved its resilience to the entire world. They have transformed Iran from a sanctioned outlier into an undeniable regional superpower with a literal chokehold on global energy transit. And in doing so, they have handed incredible, unprecedented geopolitical leverage directly to China and Russia.
It truly is a paradigm shift. Which brings us back down to earth to wrap up what this massive realignment actually means for you, the person listening to this right now. Let's recap the staggering reality of day 43 without getting lost in the weeds.
Right. We're looking at a deeply fragile ceasefire that is currently being tested by lethal bombing campaigns in Lebanon. We have incredibly high stakes, almost desperate negotiations happening at a lockdown hotel in Pakistan, built on the dramatic concession of $6 billion in unfrozen funds.
We have an active, privatized toll booth on the Strait of Hormuz dictating the flow of global energy, and we have the shattered illusion of unquestioned U.S. air supremacy, with advanced multi-million-dollar aircraft falling to cheap asymmetric drone and infrared tactics.
And this is exactly why it matters to your daily life. This isn't just distant geopolitical chess being played on a map thousands of miles away.
Not at all.
When that 4 to 6 week shipping delay finally catches up to the market, when the lack of natural gas shuts down urea production and hits the agricultural sector, this conflict is going to be felt intimately in your community.
It will be felt in the spiking numbers at the gas pump, it will be felt in the rising prices in the grocery store checkout line, and it will be felt in the surging cost of living across the entire Western world.
The decisions being made behind closed doors in Islamabad this week aren't just about shifting borders or military pride. They are quite literally about the stability of your local economy and the purchasing power of your paycheck.
Absolutely.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as this situation develops. For the last 80 years, since the end of the Second World War, global stability has relied on a foundational assumption that a single superpower, the United States, could unilaterally enforce the rules of global trade, dictate the terms of global finance, and guarantee international security. But if a regional power, utilizing relatively cheap drones, underground bunkers, and passive infrared sensors, can effectively rewrite the rules of maritime trade and currency exchange in just 43 days, what exactly does the word superpower even mean in the 21st century?
The old definitions of power simply do not fit the new symptoms we are seeing on the ground. The mechanics of the world have fundamentally changed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the mechanisms behind the narratives, and we'll be here to unpack the data as this historic event unfolds.